Hello, everybody. Good morning. How is everybody on this morning? It's rainy here in North Carolina. How is it where you are, Bonnie?
I don't know. I haven't been out yet. It's not raining.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to The Reason We Learn. Today, I am privileged to have Bonnie Kerrigan Snyder in my studio or in my channel. And Bonnie, if you're not familiar with her, is the author of the new book Undoctrinate: How Politicized Classrooms Harm Kids and Ruin Our Schools, and What We Can Do About It. This just came out this month, September 14th, I believe, so you can order it. The link is in the description box. Highly recommend. Bonnie is she's got a doctorate, first of all, of education. She's the director of high school outreach at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, otherwise known as FIRE. And FIRE, if you're not familiar, usually has focused on higher ed, but they began getting so many reports from K-12 that they decided to start outreach into K-12 and have collected a lot of information. Over the past decade, Bonnie has been working on this project, collecting information and digesting it and analyzing it, and has written this book about the problem in K-12, the crisis in American education. So welcome, Bonnie. Thank you so much for being here. As always, everybody, please like, share, put your comments and questions in the chat. All right. Now, so you're here, and I'm so grateful that you
Yeah.
are. Before the broadcast, I came up with a series of questions for you. I would like to also refer everybody watching to the podcast also listed in my community section on the channel, which is Hold My Drink with Jen Richmond. Bonnie appeared on that podcast and covered a lot of the high level topics covered in her book. And some of the things we're going to go into a little deeper here, but because they're topics that I've talked about a lot on the channel, I'm not going to ask her to repeat herself necessarily here. We're going to try to dive a little deeper. So first, Bonnie, if you could just give us a high level of what you see big picture as the crisis. How would you define it?
Well, at this point, I would say that we have a loss of faith in our school systems. I think you, as we were discussing before we came on, you're describing that, and I think that there is a great deal of broken trust now between teachers, schools, and parents. And this probably there has been a lot of activity in education schools that has led us to this moment. A lot of lack of transparency that I personally experienced. I personally had to pull a child out of a school where there were some bad actors and bad actions taking place. So I would say we have a crisis of faith and a crisis of direction in our schools right now.
Okay. What direction do you see them taking?
Oh, well, clearly a Marxist direction, which is in alignment with what's going on in the ed schools and has been happening in higher ed for a while. But along with that, there's a lot of lack of transparency. There's deception taking place, which has broken the trust. And you're seeing this anger and this frustration breaking out at school board meetings across the country. And it's not a pretty sight to see. I totally understand the frustration, though.
Right, right. So one of the things that you brought up um in the podcast that I watched, we were talking about you were talking about some of the specific things that are wrong with what they are doing, things that are breaking that trust. And you mentioned that there are sort of violations of codes of ethics. And I've mentioned on my channel that I think there are violations of the rights of students and PPRA in particular.
Right.
What can you tell us about teaching? You've been a teacher,
Yeah.
and you were trained as a teacher. What do parents need to understand about ethical codes for educators and what you see as being violated?
Well, that's probably the genesis of the book is I was watching what was going on and just thinking, how could you think that this is okay? There are ethical guidelines that govern the profession of teaching. And if there were a subtext to my book, the whole time I was writing it, and sort of the back of my mind, I'm thinking, this is not a free for all, people. We're not just winging it. You're not just making it up. I mean, education, the practice of pedagogy has standards, and there are procedures and methods that we use that rely on age-old wisdom of how to bring up young people into a free society. And all of this seems to be being ignored. So I just collected them. And I have the link that I can give you on my website, which is undoctrinate.org. And
Mhm.
so, for example, the NEA of all places, which, I think a lot of people think might be one of the worst actors, or certainly enabling of some of the worst actors, has actually a really well written, articulate, and eloquent code of ethics that you can look up. Just Google NEA code of ethics, and you'll see that they acknowledge that teachers will not uh, restrict students' access to unreasonably to different points of view, which is exactly what I think people are seeing happening in the schools. So you have codes of ethics with the unions, you have codes of ethics with disciplinary organizations like the National Council for for Teachers of English, rather, or for the National Council for the Social Studies. And if you read them, they are very sound. The problem is that apparently it's not being taught to teachers in training, and it's not being enforced. And, a profession needs to police itself. I like to say that, or to point out that teachers are licensed by the state, and they have to pass examinations the same way that doctors do, or dentists, or even cosmetologists. And the reason why they were licensed by the state is because you're in a position of trust, of public trust, and you're in a position where you can do harm. And so licenses can be pulled. There are disciplinary, and disciplinary. Before I was talking about subjects like English or history, but there are disciplinary procedures like punishment for teachers who violate their codes of ethics, and also states have them. So I'm in Pennsylvania, and if you go to the Department of Education website in your state and Google code of ethics for educators, or Google disciplinary procedures for educators, there will be clearly outlined procedures, which I think are rarely invoked. I know in Pennsylvania they have this wonderful, um, really succinct guideline for how teachers should conduct themselves. And it says, before you undertake any action in the classroom, ask yourself this question: whose needs are being met, mine or the students? And the only acceptable answer is the students. And I think a lot of what is going on is that teachers right now are putting their own interests and their own needs ahead of those of the students, which is not why you're paid to be in that classroom.
A few things you said stood out to me. I'm going to go in order of how when you said them. One, you said about the education, and it's, what a student needs to be educated for to live in a free society.
Yeah.
And my question is, have the educators and the educational establishment made a decision without telling us that that is not their goal anymore?
Yeah.
It
Yes.
feels that way.
Well, yeah, we could talk more about Marxism and how it's implemented and how it operates. And I'm not actually opposed to teaching about Marxism in the classroom. I think that's a big part of what we're talking to. It's okay to teach about things, but it's different to teach belief in such things, and to teach students to affirm certain worldviews, which gets into the whole religious argument. You can actually teach about the Bible in school, and probably should, because there's so much of Western culture you can't understand without understanding those underpinnings. But to be educated in a free society isn't just a matter of memorizing certain dates or certain facts, although those things are important. And there's always a conversation going on about what's going to be included and what we just don't have time to cover. But it's also a process. And students right now are being treated as though they're the product of education,
Mm.
but they really are the purpose of education, and the process is everything. I point out in my book, that students are autonomous ends in themselves. They are not means to anyone else's end. And I think we have a fundamental disagreement on this point. I think that we have teachers who are using students as means to their cherished political aims and ends, and that is a misuse of their access to other citizens' children in the classroom. We're talking about minors. We're talking about vulnerable parties who do not have fully developed faculties yet. They don't have full investiture of their rights. and so they deserve protection. And instead, their access to them, traditionally, the way I was educated, I had a very good public school education, and so I still have sort of misty memories of that. I understand that not everyone enjoyed their education maybe as much as I did in the public schools, and maybe that's one of the reasons why there are some changes that people want to implement. I get that, and I can appreciate that, but you know, other citizens' children deserve the same respect that you would want other citizens to show to your children. So the golden rule is one of our kind of cultural agreements that we've always had in place. Don't treat other people, treat other people the way you'd like to be treated, which actually does come from the Bible, incidentally. So yeah, there's always going to be this conversation about whose values are going and what information is going to be imparted in the classroom. But again, the process is everything. The process by which we decide that, we do that in public in a democratic society, not behind closed doors.
Right, which gets to the next point that I wanted to come back to that you made about the lack of transparency and the violation of the code of ethics. Interestingly enough, a locals member of mine showed me the hard copy of the NEA magazine out right now. They have their own internal magazine, and somehow she got a copy of it from a friend, and she's mailing it to me because she started reading it, and it reads like the Communist Manifesto. I mean, not literally, but it's when you talk about their code of ethics and then what they're putting out to their teachers, it couldn't be farther afield. But who really is doing any kind of proactive enforcement though of that code of ethics? It feels like how the IDEA is enforced by parents, or it can only be because there's really no other enforcement mechanism. Is that also the case with this kind of thing? Are you sort of counting on principals and superintendents and other teachers to, like you said, self-police, and now it's on the parents to do it?
Yeah. When you read these, I have this running list of what I call whoppers, and I can barely keep up on it, and I have help at Fire to try to keep up with it. For a while, it was really hard to find these stories because parents were so afraid to come forward. But now it's like drinking through a fire hose, and we can barely keep up, which is good. So that is one of the means of holding them accountable, is just sunlight. Sunlight is a great disinfectant. Right now, it is coming mostly from the parents and also from students who are filming their teachers, which I can't even imagine having to be accountable for holding my teacher accountable. I
Right.
did feel that way when I was in college and in graduate school, that things are going on that are ridiculous, and how can I? But when my K-12 educators were all very ethical and very well trained. And I like to point out too that you look at when you went to school. You and I went to school in the '80s, same year apparently. But our teachers probably, went to school in 20 years earlier, right? So in the '60s, and then who taught them, right? So people from the '40s, probably very patriotic people in the, aftermath of World War II. So it's interesting to look at which age group is educating the current crop of educators. And that's another interesting issue, because what part of what we're dealing here is a demographic bubble of people in a radical age group. 20-year-olds tend to be a radical age group, and what we're also dealing with is a baby boomlet. These are kind of the children of the baby boom, and they're a demographic bubble which tends to emphasize and to increase the impact of the youth culture, which right now is radical, leaning socialist, in the same way that the '60s, their parents, to a large extent, um, also that was an age group that was very radical. I mean, I was born during that era, but I didn't come of age during that era, so I shouldn't say their parents. Um, but in any case, when you have these big bubbles, it does tend to impact the culture, and that's what's happening now. I guess it's the echo of the baby boom right now. So, in terms of holding them accountable, what do I think? Well, a profession that doesn't police itself becomes, there's a word for that, and it's corrupted. And they will lose and are losing the trust of the community, which is what has happened at this point. I didn't expect it to happen as quickly as it has. Like I said, like you pointed out, this book has been in process for a long time. I had a very difficult time selling it, which tells you a lot
I'm
about
shocked.
yeah, exactly. I actually had to fire my agent over getting this book published. And as long as it took me to get it published, by the time it was accepted, we couldn't get it to print fast enough because this problem has just cascaded. It's like a snowball, and it's just really this past year hit a level that is intolerable. And of course, everybody it probably is aware here that homeschooling is booming and that enrollment in public schools is declining, and they're losing public trust. And it's going to take a long time for them to rebuild that now.
Interesting. Um, so you mentioned also in that podcast and also in your book that a lot of what's being taught, if we're getting into the specifics of it, um, is not age appropriate. Now, I've mentioned that on this channel, but tell us more about that specifically, if you would.
Yeah, and I would also argue not developmentally appropriate, but there a lot of these theories I came across, and one of the reasons I wrote the book is I was introduced to these a little bit when I was an undergrad at Harvard. I was an English major. A lot of these theories derive or started in the humanities. There's this Babylon Bee story that jokes that it was a lab leak from a humanities lab.
That's funny.
Um, yeah,
Not
and
altogether untrue.
exactly. And at Harvard at the time in the 80s, in the English department, the crazy English department in the 1980s was at Yale. And they were whole hog into the French deconstructionists and postmodernism and I don't know, post structuralism and a lot of really impenetrable theories that I enjoyed zero amount. I did end up after earning a master's in school counseling, I did end up going back to get a PhD in English, thinking that I would become an English professor. And by then, a lot of these theories had taken hold. There are Marxist elements to these theories, and I don't want to get for one thing, I don't enjoy these theories, and I'm not really that interested in CRT. And I demonstrated that because I dropped out over these kinds of theories in graduate school. My thought was if to me, the purpose of writing is to communicate something clearly. And I would read, Derrida or Foucault, and I would be like, if you can't communicate clearly to me whatever it is you're trying to say here, then I think you have failed in the exercise of the writing process. Uh, and I would look at what was being published in the academy, publish or perish, and what you'd have to write to succeed as an English professor, and I said, I don't want to devote 1 minute of my life to doing what apparently is all the rage right now in higher education. So I dropped out, and I was actually a fully funded student. I was being paid to go to school, and so that gives you an idea of how much I thought of the education I was getting there. Um, but fast forward when my younger daughter was in school and started to be exposed to some of these theories, I recognized them immediately because I had studied in a humanities department. Incidentally, humanities used to be one of the most heavily enrolled of the, English literature,
Mhm.
particularly in colleges, and their enrollments have collapsed. So, they deconstructed it all right. I used to call it destructionism, and they really destructed their own disciplines. Nobody wants to do it because it's the most cheerless. Um, I mean, it
It's
used to
actually
be.
good news to me. I feel like that's good news.
Well, the
It's
bad
bad
news
news in
is,
terms of our perpetuation of the canon and the understanding, in the Western civilization, all that, but in terms of
yeah,
fewer
getting
minds
getting
being
back to what you
corrupted.
said, they told me that, and I complained, and they said, "Well, we're deconstructing the canon." And I said, "Well, that's very interesting for you who already had a chance to learn it. But what about us, the new students who would like to learn the canon first before we deconstruct it?" And they had no answer to that. And so that's what I mean about age appropriate. I think at the time when I was in graduate school, that was all the rage among English professors. But what about incoming students? They weren't teaching us at the level where we were
Right.
in a way that was appropriate to us. And so they lost us. And the discipline is collapsing. And I think that's what's happening to students too. I think that applying a critical lens to American history is a rather esoteric, sophisticated approach, and it's fine for a person who is well versed in the introduction in the basic facts of a discipline to apply different lenses to it and look at things from different angles. But that is by no means the best way to introduce really basic topics to young people. And I always joke that, most of these kids couldn't tell you if World War One was before or after the Civil War, but you're supposed to analyze it from a Marxist perspective, what power and oppression dynamics were operating as opposed to which countries were involved and who were the major figures that leading those countries. I mean, they just don't have their facts straight yet. And
Right.
um,
Even to
so
criticize the founders, if you don't know any European history or you don't know the history, the broader history of the time period in which they lived and what informed their views, if you're looking at that in isolation with your present day mindset, it's easy to find fault with them, isn't it?
well,
Right?
and
Because
like, and I wanted to learn in an English program how to be a great writer. I didn't want to criticize the great writers, and I just went to class. Back then, the thing was feminist criticism, and I would go to class after class after class, and the only thing that would happen was that somebody would complain that the writer was a white male, and then we're supposed to condemn and it's like, well, I already knew that. This is nothing. It was just not inspirational. It wasn't aspirational, and I don't know what happened to. Like you said, it's good that the English departments have collapsed, but I mean, it used to be that they taught literary appreciation, and that's
sure.
what I wanted to do. And I
Right.
also, like I said, wanted to learn how to be a great writer. I don't know where a person goes to learn how to become, a writer on the level of a Tolstoy, uh, unless you can figure it out for yourselves. Because if you go to graduate school in English literature, you're going to be taught how to criticize Tolstoy.
Right. No, I agree with you. I was sort of tongue in cheek. It is a tragedy actually, because for the reason you gave, that these students have a right to learn what it is before they criticize it. You also made the point
Yeah,
in the other podcast. You said, you don't learn about War and Peace by reading a review of War and Peace, and
yeah.
that's basically what they're doing.
It's a matter of balance, and it's also a matter of perspective. It's like and age appropriate. I mean, cynicism. I'm sorry if you are an older, pessimistic, cynical professor or teacher, but childhood is not a time for cynicism. Children have
Totally
their
agree.
whole lives ahead of them, and what they need is encouragement and optimism. And yeah, they need realism too, but it's a matter of proportion
Mhm.
and appropriateness. And I would just argue that the younger a person is, the more you would want to fill them with encouragement and optimism and a little bit of
Right.
realism and criticism. But it's peppered. It's like seasoning. Everything can't be spices, or else the dish is terrible.
Right. Right. If it's also exhausting. If
Ugh,
everything is negative and everything
and
is controversial, it's very
and
exhausting.
boring.
Mhm.
And boring because you walk into the classroom and you already know what the right answer is. You know who's guilty. You know that we're just gonna. Everything is. They give you a hammer and everything's a nail, and you just pound
Yeah,
away.
right.
And yeah,
Now as the
kids.
counselor, also, are you concerned? I mean, you're obviously concerned about the cynicism, the age appropriateness, but this is going all the way down now to kindergarten. And I just got word last week from a guest. There's a preschool company trying to sell its curriculum across the nation, in particular into my state, North Carolina, that alleges that babies as young as 6 months are racist.
Yeah. Uh, there again, going back to ethical guidelines, one of the foundation for a helping relationship, of which counseling is one, but also education, is this concept of unconditional acceptance. And that basically means that people don't improve in the presence of harsh negative judgment. So if somebody comes to you as a counselor, and let's say maybe they have an alcoholism problem, or maybe they have behavioral issues or whatever it is. Maybe they've committed a crime. You don't start by saying, wow, you're a really terrible person. And let's talk about all of the ways in which you've fallen short. It's like, okay, this is you. This is where you are right now in your life. How do you feel about that? Where do you want to go? What steps could you take to move forward? It's unconditional. You accept where they start, you know. So when children come to kindergarten, okay, some of them, most of them can't read yet, but some of them maybe can, and some of them are going to be brighter than others. But it's okay. You're here. You're in my class, and wherever you are, that's okay, because you're all welcome here. That's not what this is promoting. This is saying that some of you sort of bear, and then starts to get into spiritual realms, which is something I don't go into the book, but I've been sort of really cogitating on ever since I wrote it. You know, this idea of original sin, and they even use that term, America's original sin, or our, you know, forgiveness or redemption. It's like, nope, you're born into this category, and because you're a white male or whatever, then you know, have to engage in a lifelong practice of trying to rectify all the unearned privileges. I mean, this is a very discouraging, dispiriting, and hopeless worldview that actually, if you think about it, and I'm no theologian, but it really conflicts with the Judeo Christian foundations that most families bring to school in this country. And I don't think you get to undermine a family's religion in a secular classroom, because we have a little thing called the separation of church and state. And
Mhm.
Bill Barr actually gave a really interesting speech on how some of this is starting to interfere with the free exercise of religion that's
Mhm.
guaranteed
For
by
sure.
the Constitution. So they're really getting into some deep water and territory that I don't think that is gonna hold water.
A lot of compelled speech too, which you also talk about in the book. So,
Absolutely.
parents need to familiarize themselves with what the actual definition of compelled speech is.
Yeah,
So
students in school, according to as affirmed by West Virginia, versus Barnett, um, cannot compel students to stand and salute or genuflect to causes or ideas that they don't believe in. And apparently teachers haven't learned. There's a lot of things not being covered in education schools these days, Deb.
right,
You could
right.
fill books with what these teachers haven't been taught.
Well, that brings me to I do wanna kinda jump back a bit to a comment that somebody made in the chat, and that was this. I'm against occupational licensing because this empowers the government to police the teachers and it always goes one way, the conflict of interest concept. So would you agree with that that's kind of part of why the transparency has fallen by the wayside and they're not really policing it because it serves somebody's interests at this point?
So we put together two articles that I would recommend at Fire, and one of them, and Greg Lukianoff, our president and CEO, is involved in both of them. And one is called 13 Points in the Critical Theory Bills Debate. I'll provide the link so that we'll have them at the end. The other one is 10 Principles for Opposing Thought Reform in K-12.
Oh, I did a video about that one. That was excellent.
Yeah,
Loved it.
yeah, yeah, and the no compelled speech is a big part of it. So when it comes to occupational licensing, it is teachers speak teach teachers' speech in schools is government speech. It is the government um, delivering their messaging to the population in a way that serves the government's needs. And traditionally, this has been understood to sort of fall along the lines of promoting domestic tranquility. But also Bill Barr in the speech I just recommended talks about, you know, forging the unum out of the pluribus. So yeah, I understand your point, but this has never been a secret that the purpose of public schools is sort of to promote the public interest. And there are checks and balances, and we do get to vote for, you know, who's in the legislature. And I guess it's varies, I think, from state to state how the Department of Education is um, how the employment there works. So yes, that is true, and it's both. I guess that sword slices both ways, because I actually am hearing much worse stories coming out of private schools than I am out of the public schools, because in the public schools there are more layers of oversight, and it's easier to yeah. So live by the sword, die by the sword, I think. And
Okay.
I know that there are a lot of private school parents who kind of wish they had some of the mechanisms in place because basically in a private school, it's just get lost. If you don't like what's going on here, there's really no appeals process.
That's an important point because I have had a lot of people say to me, "Well, I'll just pull my children out and put them in private school and that will solve my problem." To which you say,
These problems, from what I'm seeing, really are most advanced in the private schools. And when I say problems, I mean of heavy-handed ideological imposition and trying to compel affirmation out of students, and mostly in private schools and in affluent public schools. That's where it seems to be most advanced for a lot of reasons that would make for another really interesting discussion. I think it sort of gets into the
"Let's
realm
set
of
it up." No, I'm kidding.
huh?
Let's set it up. No. We will have that discussion, I hope. So
Yeah.
keep it going. I didn't mean to interrupt you, sorry.
Well, I mean, I hesitate. I don't want to like try to psychoanalyze people from afar, but it's a really interesting thought process why we are seeing these. Why in affluent communities are they pushing Marxism so heavily? I mean, the term reaction formation comes to mind if you've studied um, psychology, and I'll just leave it at that. Google reaction formation.
Right. Which makes me wanna bring up something else you mentioned, which is the anti-bullying campaigns of, let's
Mhm.
say, the '90s and early aughts, okay? They were big, after Columbine in particular,
Yeah,
lots
my
of talk
kids
about.
were subjected to a lot of it. Yeah.
Right, and I did a video about that, sort of my own, just expounding on it, and talked about some of the research from books like, Nurture Shock, where they looked at how it was actually found to be counterproductive, and even some of the
Mhm.
so-called positive social messages in television and entertainment that were put in were backfiring on preschoolers. They took so long to set up the negative scenario and packed the resolution into the last couple minutes, and kids took away the snark and they forgot about the message. They didn't understand, they didn't connect the dots. So um do you think the current ideologies that are circulating are being now weaponized also and creating bullying scenarios?
Oh, yeah. Kids are definitely learning how to weaponize the language of CRT the same way that I think they learned cynically, maybe subconsciously, to leverage anti bullying practices in order to, what do kids want? Status and power, right? I guess we all want that to a certain extent. And the anti bullying programs that my kids were put through were have sort of morphed into DEI programming now, but they have a couple things in common. And one of the things they have in common is it's a side door by which a lot of unregulated practitioners of something get into the schools and impart what some are calling, in some instances, sort of unlicensed therapies. And again, teachers in public schools are supposed to be licensed by the state. They're supposed to be certified. You're supposed to stay in your area of certification. So if I'm an English teacher, I'm not going to be teaching kids phys ed or how to do calculus because I don't know how to do calculus. So that's another problem we're having is this out of area teaching. And so much of this CRT stuff really does not fall under the disciplinary training of the instructors. And so anti-bullying, Greg Lukianoff, again, in his Coddling of the American Mind book, you, you know, eh, he speculates that the anti-bullying program maybe oversensitized or hypersensitized kids to
Mhm.
perceive danger, maybe to magnify life's ordinary difficulties. I call them everyday adversities. Sometimes some of those are verbal, and to look for organizational remedies, which means appeal to an authority. And I think that the CRT ideology fits into that as well, which is you find a grievance, you find an inequity, and then you locate the source of it, which I guess is systemic racism or systemic sexism or something like that. And then you appeal to the authorities to do something about it. So it's a lot of, and this reminds me of my counseling training, fault finding and grievance mongering are not typically mental activities that are associated with mental health or general pleasantness in your daily life. These are usually bad habits that we try to correct in counseling, but these are now being taught to kids. That's not to say that I don't think that there's ever injustice in this world. There is, but there's also, so a counter argument we often hear is, oh, so does that mean that we shouldn't teach about Jim Crow and slavery? No, we should, of course, teach about bad things and good things. And also don't forget that there are good things too. I feel like we're only teaching bad things and that balance has been lost and needs to be restored.
Right. And we're not teaching universal values. You mentioned this as well, that when you're in especially a public setting, but really any school where you're even a private school where you've got a
Right,
diverse array of people and values at home,
right.
it's not for the teachers to decide which are the correct values, or if they're going to, they better state it very clearly up front in the private setting so you can choose before, buyer
Right.
beware, right?
It
But in a public setting, it has no place. You're
Yeah,
supposed to find that lowest common denominator of universal shared ideas that
that's
right?
it. Teachers in schools and again, the Bill Barr speech goes into how we've sort of subtracted over the decades, that moral teachings that were grounded in Judeo-Christian values used to be openly inculcated in the schools. And then we decided that we had to separate that, and there was this process of subtraction until we got down to these LCD, lowest common denominator values that are a little bit thin, but still we're something that we shared in common. And these are things like honesty or hard work. And even that's under, questioning now. Um, the golden rule is an example of one that I think still stands. But he says, we got to the point where we subtracted all of the religious values out of it, and now they're sort of imposing a whole new worldview that is actually antithetical to the traditional religious values that most families bring to public schools. And he's arguing, I think, as you are too, that at this point it's time to just give families vouchers and let them educate. Like Jewish families and Catholic families, I think a long time ago decided that the public schools weren't meeting their needs. And so they set up separate schools. And of course, our society has become, you don't hear the term multicultural as much anymore, but the core that was once Protestant really maybe is not as big of a core as it once was, and so there is a question of whose values which values, um, and that's part of the problem as well.
Right. Then I would hope we could at least go back to things like the Bill of Rights as a source of information to determine those
Which is
values.
which is grounded in Judeo-Christian Western thinking.
True,
Yeah.
but I think since I would like to think we all agree we don't want to, subvert those, not using the democratic process, not using representative government, and we don't want the schools to just teach it out of existence. That's supposed to be discussed in the public square and voted on and things like that, and
Well, that
and
that is
debated.
ex that is exactly what unites us. Our entire culture derives out of Enlightenment thinking, which is very grounded in um, biblical concepts that are embedded into our system of laws and into our, even capitalism. The idea of free speech, the idea of free markets, the idea of free enterprise. It's
Mhm.
very difficult it's impossible to separate these from the Western worldview that led to them in the first place. And of course, this
Right.
is exactly what's under assault. I do on my website have a section. I wrote an article called "How to Raise an American" that I'm going to be building up, and I look at, okay, this is what's going on at your children's schools. So what can you do to counteract this, or at least to balance it at home? So I look at our economic system. I look at our system of laws. I look at how we interact with one another. I look at, oh my gosh, I go into like 7 different categories that are not explicitly being taught. And the example I like to give is the reason I there were a few reasons I pulled my daughter out of the school where she was, but one precipitating event was that she was sat at a table. They were given the Communist Manifesto to read and then asked to debate the merits of communism versus capitalism. And they
In
were
what grade was this?
not 10th, I
10th.
think.
Okay. So
Yeah, and I didn't mind that she was given the Communist Manifesto, but I do very much mind that she was not given anything to read about capitalism.
right.
So I'm trying to provide parents with because there's just this idea that people in America absorb and understand all of this via osmosis, but we don't. And the way you know that we don't is because other people come in as immigrants and they take to it in ways that native born Americans don't because they've experienced the antithesis. So, when you swim in water, you don't know you're wet. And kids are not explicitly being taught the value of what it is we have in America and why we have so many thousands of people sitting on the border waiting to get in.
Yeah, right, exactly. I would like to talk a little bit more about teacher education because one of the points that we touched on it already, but one of the points that I've made on the channel in terms of policing this, for example, is that even if you're able to make some headway with administrators and if what you're complaining about falls under the purview of the school board, and what we're learning is that it really in only 2 states in the nation do they have a say in the particulars of curriculum. Other than that, they're mostly about the budget around the curriculum. It's sort of a rubber stamp, and there are also a lot of top-down mandates now coming in. New York and California have their mandates.
Mhm.
So going to the school board is of sort of limited utility, but I don't want to get off topic. It lives in the teacher's mind in a way that I think, especially because there is a level of, as you pointed out in the other podcast, certainty and messianic complex that some of them have, that is not. I don't know how, you could remove the book or you could remove the learning material and they'll take hold of, here's my little copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And with their worldview, they could teach this in a critical theory way. So because it's here. That's my argument. Am I wrong? First of all.
I'm sorry. So your argument is that the teachers are not being educated properly?
No, that they are being educated in alignment with this worldview, the
Yeah.
critical pedagogy sort of worldview.
Mhm.
So what they are engaging in and teaching in the first place is political activism. That
Yep.
is their primary goal, to create other activists.
Yep.
And so we can pull out certain materials and it's still going to be in their minds, that the way they're being educated and the way they're even being recruited is such that, and appealed to, is such that we've got a really big problem, because you can't ban that, you can't legislate that out. There's things you can't do to change somebody's worldview when a profession is captured in, like, culturally, and their psychology as well. But
Yeah.
where am
Well,
I going wrong? Is I guess what I'm saying. That's my assessment of it, but if I'm wrong, please help
well,
me.
our goal at Fire is to begin providing professional education and to try to reach out to the ed schools because clearly this is where a lot of these problems are coming from. This idea that teachers are meant to function as educators leads to using students as means to your end, but as my training in counseling, these are autonomous people who are ends in themselves. They are not implements for your use. So I actually feel sorry for some of these younger teachers who are coming into the schools. I think they themselves are victims of poor education. I think many of them are salvageable. I think some of them are incorrigible. But I think that parents need to continue to stand up and firmly, vociferously, politely, but clearly and emphatically draw the line on how they will not be using my children to further your activist aims. And I also take hope in this that the the medium is the message. And the way that these teachers are treating students in school will not be forgotten, and I don't think is being appreciated by the kids. Kids are people. They're human people. People don't like being treated this way. People don't like being manipulated. And I think that what you think you're accomplishing, you may be very surprised at how your students actually feel about how you're treating them. And you may be creating the very backlash that is going to engulf you.
That's fascinating, because, there's a TikTok challenge going on now where the kids are vandalizing school property and
Yeah.
filming it, and I've been fascinated by this because I'm trying to figure out what they're angry
There's an
about.
old saying that what is repressed gets expressed. I can't draw a direct line from one to the other, but do you like being treated this way? Nobody likes here's the thing that fascinates me, and I'm actually halfway through an article that I'm writing on this, is the obsession with the current ideology. CRT is one manifestation of it. Marx is power and oppression. Okay, so yeah, they have their intersecting matrices with Christians on the top and able bodies on the top and men are on the top and white people are on the top. And so they're really into dissecting who has power over whom, but conveniently they overlook the most dramatic power imbalance in a school that you could possibly imagine, which is adult over child and teacher over student, and the amount of power. So they are giving a direct object lesson in how power dynamics operate. And I learned this in effectiveness training, which I highly recommend. If there's a parent effectiveness training, there's teacher effectiveness training. Power, whenever you use power on another person, there is a cost that you paid for it. You think that you accomplished something, but whatever you gained, you lost something else. And usually, what you use, power and influence, are inversely related. The more power you use on a person, the less influence you have over them. So, teachers control when you can go to the bathroom, they control your grades, they can administer punishment to you, they have the power to humiliate you in public, they can do all of these things, and they're giving you a lecture on power and oppression dynamics. I think that they should look in the mirror and wield their own power more judiciously and respectfully for the less powerful people in their classrooms.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you made that point. I think that is such an important point. This
It's so
power,
obvious. It is so obvious. I
isn't
don't know
it?
how you stand there and give a lecture about power to kids and then you yell at them if they don't agree with you. What? What?
Exactly. Or
That's
even if you're not yelling, see, because they obviously aren't gonna yell at a kindergartner, they'll just be like, it's the kindergarten teacher equivalent of bless your heart. So, and
yeah.
when you're 6 and you're newly away from a safe, comfortable environment where people love you, that's enough. That can be enough.
Oh, yeah, the evil eye, right? I can remember being taught in my teacher training, "Work on your eye, work on your evil eye," and it was meant jokingly because teachers can give you that look, and it's a way of it can be wielded, it can be wielded well, or it can be wielded for evil purposes, the teacher eye. Um,
Even the
but yeah, I
concept
mean,
of implicit bias is hilarious. "Let's teach you about your implicit biases. By the way, everyone who looks like this is this."
right, right.
It's like,
I'm
"What?"
dumbstruck at how teachers now are blurting out. They apparently feel comfortable enough, and I guess that's what comes from feeling like you have a super majority. If I can give you other reasons for optimism, more teachers dislike this than we know. We hear from them regularly at Fire, teachers who don't want any part of this, who know that this is not how proper teaching is conducted. But I'm amazed at teachers who are going on. Well, this one was caught by students filming their teachers. I mean, what does that tell you about kids knowing that this is wrong, right? That they get their cell phone out and start filming. And this teacher is the one who said, "Go ahead and tattle on me to the administration. They're not going to do anything anyway."
Utah.
And she also said she was telling them that to get vaccinated, and if you don't, then basically, I guess you're a bad person, and you don't have to do what she said. You don't have to do what your parents say because y'all parents are dumber than you. And then she said out loud, "And if you disagree with me, you'd better keep it to yourself because I'll just make fun of you." Which is interesting that she verbalized that. But that's yeah, I'll just ridicule you in public because I have the power to exact that punishment, that pain on you. And this is a teacher who thinks that she is leading the way forward into a brighter, more equitable future. I don't,
Right.
s-
I I'm not sure they think that deeply. I had a
no.
23-year-old teacher, my daughter's 3rd grade, teacher, my youngest, who yelled at me, um, and, like, I was she called me during the dinner hour. Like, I didn't call her. She called me at my home and began not only yelling at me, but talking about my child, my 8-year-old child, as if she were an adult. "Did
Yeah.
she tell you what she did? Did she tell you what she did?" And I'm like, are you serious right now? Like,
Right.
this is
Yeah.
goodbye, like it. And she didn't understand because there was later a meeting with her and the principal and so forth. She, you could see it on her face and even in her interaction with me afterwards in person that she felt completely justified. There was
Yep.
no apology. And I was the bad guy. Absolutely no self-awareness at all.
Yeah, there used to be a presumed implied collaborative relationship between parents and teachers, and unfortunately now it's become adversarial. A lot of these teachers are 23 years old. They're young. It's extremely difficult to teaching is extremely difficult. It is a nonstop impromptu performance with, I mean, let's face it, kids can be super annoying. They're immature, and pretty soon it makes you start to behave immaturely because you absorb it a little bit. Just a good handy tip for parents is if you can influence which teachers your children get in school.
Mhm.
Sometimes sometimes parents get to ask for the older teachers. Generally speaking, they have a lot more wisdom. They have a lot more life experience. They have
Right.
means of controlling the class without losing their tempers. There are exceptions. I mean, sometimes
Right.
you get so old you become the crankiest teacher. I can remember in my school when I was a kid that there was a teacher who was, I mean, there were kids getting their mouths taped shut when I was in school. It didn't happen to me. And who literally threw chairs. That was not good either.
In Charlotte, we're not allowed to have any say, and I tried multiple times. But
Yeah,
what's most interesting about this experience is that what it was they were supposed to prepare a speech, sort of an oral report. And my daughter worked really hard. And we're talking about a kid who is not excited to get up in front of other people.
most
So we
aren't.
practiced and we went through it and got her all, ready. She was ready. Okay. And she went in for the day where it was due. And the teacher said, well, not enough people completed it on time. So we're putting it off to another day. And she was sort of deflated because she had practiced and worked so hard to get it done on time. Remember, this is third grade.
Yeah.
And so then
Yeah,
I wrote.
that falls under the category, "Life's not fair, honey," right?
That is true,
Yeah,
but at the same time, I wrote to the teacher and I said, "I understand that you wanna make sure everybody gets their turn and get to do it, but what message are you sending to those who did it on time and did it by the due date and who worked really hard and so forth?" So, I was just a question. I just said something to think about because my daughter now feels like deadlines don't matter,
right.
and because she even
Yeah,
said, like, "What difference does it make?" And she was already starting to get that, 8-year-old cynicism, and the to then this was a couple days after it occurred, that's why she called me. Because apparently 2 days later, because of that email, before she ever talked to me or talked to my daughter or anything, she just called on her out of the blue. Like, "Okay, you're ready, so come up and talk to the class." Like, suddenly decided that was gonna be the day they would do it, and of course, the poor kid just froze and
yeah.
asked to not go first. And
She
that's
took
when
her
she
frustration on
Mhm.
you out on your child.
Right, so when she asked
Very
me, "Well, do you know what
unprofessional.
she did? Did you know"
Yeah,
she wasn't ready when I called on her. I we're talking, like, I had to hang up because
yeah.
if I had stayed on the phone call, I wouldn't have said anything polite. I wanna address this super chat because I think this is important. Rin Wesley says, "Thank you for the super chat, first of all. Had a chat with an 18-year-old recently. He says all his friends are depressed, hopeless, but craving community, purpose, and belonging. They're all trapped in their social media communities." Any thoughts?
Oh, well, I think that COVID this past year probably intensified that, right?
Yeah.
Um Well, I mean, that's an entirely different issue. Get outdoors. I mean, that's just my obvious thought. We live
Okay.
in a neighborhood that has a creek behind our house, and I will say it was delightful watching kids all throughout COVID when school wasn't happening. That creek was overrun with children.
Right.
There was like little huckleberry fins just going wild all over the place, and I was just thought, this is awesome. More power to you. Maybe this is the future. Um, yeah, I think I heard Bill Maher last night, and he was saying that, young people sometimes make fun of old people because they can't work an iPhone, but he said, "I make fun of young people because they can't stop looking at their iPhone."
It's a
Um,
great point. Like, go
uh,
outside,
go
get fresh
outside.
air. So, I
Yeah,
mean, and
that's the solution to a lot of things in life.
I don't mean to be glib, and even when I've said that to my
Yeah,
kids, I say, "You don't understand," because I think there's something going on as well, which is that, they're smart and they see what's going on, they hear what's going on, they hear the adults, see the adults. And I think what you talked about with the cynicism that's been cultivated is something now that is sucking their hope away from them so they don't have the impetus to go outside. If you have to already feel like there's something that's in you that you want to support or develop to do the make good choices for yourself. And what I'm concerned about is that this pedagogy is breaking down their own boundaries and getting inside their heads. Greg talked about it in that one piece. You talked about the 10
yeah.
points about cognitive distortion. So
Well,
even yeah,
yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Well, another going back to the social media, I mean, it's pretty well understood. I think that girls are more. So I don't know if this is a girl or a boy that this person's asking about, but it's another irony is that schools and teachers, the teaching profession has become even more female since we were in school, even though, there was the women's liberation movement and women can do this and do that and be astronauts and everything. And yet teaching has become even more female. And it is an observation that a lot of the most ardent proponents of sort of social justice education and political activism in schools seem to be women. And I'll just leave that for whatever analysis you think it's worth, but it's a component in what's going on. And
Right. I think it hits male and female students a little differently in the sense that I've seen it too. I've seen the same thing. I have all daughters. So they're not susceptible to this. Like they're at home, they're being homeschooled and they weren't even beforehand. Part of why they wanted to come back to homeschooling was they saw this happening. This is
yeah.
nuts. These people are cuckoo. And but if you're a boy and you're being constantly told how bad you are and what's wrong with you and you're the reason for all the problems. I mean, I'm not a boy, so I don't know, but I imagine that's got to be hard to take over time. Where you're
Well,
just like,
and
ugh,
have you seen the stories about the decline of males in colleges? They're not gonna sign up for this voluntarily. They're compelled to go K through 12, but they're like, "Why would I enroll for more of this?" Now
exactly,
you have, ratios of 60-40, 70-30 in colleges, and, what did you expect?
exactly. I couldn't have said it better. So, let's see. I think we've really covered a lot of stuff. What's your what's your feeling about the future of public education in general? Where do we go from here? What's your degree of optimism? Things like that.
Well, I like to think we've hit rock bottom and peak crazy. I I'm a fan just intrinsically of public education. I want it to go well. I want it to be good. I know that there are always going to be a segment of the population that has to rely on it. I honestly did not know there was such a thing as private schools until I was in college. Just we just didn't have that. We had Catholic schools where I grew up at. There was no such thing as private schools, and it did not know what they were. um I'm not opposed to them, but I what do I think is going to happen? I think we need to I think we need to form new schools. I think one of the problems with any organization is that the organization's goal becomes perpetuating the organization. And there's this like running joke in schools when the kids aren't there, like on an in-service day. Oh, it's so nice. The school's so nice when the kids aren't here. Well, because the teachers start to think that the school exists for them because they stay, but the kids come and go.
Right.
And so I think that's just an organizational dynamic that has played out and has maybe reached its logical level of lowest nadir possible. But I think, when you hit rock bottom, there's only one place to go, one direction to go but up. I'd like to see hybrid models where kids can go to school for the parts of education that their parents can't provide. Like
Mhm.
I would send my kids for physics and chemistry and things like that, but I would be very well versed and able to handle history and literature and I think there should be more flexibility where kids can choose to come and go. And let's not overlook the good parts that schools provide too. I mean, I've worked in South Carolina as a guidance counselor, and there are some very sad cases of kids who would be lost without their public schools, and the service that they provide is invaluable. And kids who not every kid has a parent like you who can provide excellent homeschooling and has good resources. Some kids will just be lost
Right.
and just completely neglected educationally and in many other ways if it weren't for public schools. So I think we have a duty to do this right and to hold the schools accountable. And that means including the ed schools as well, holding them accountable for doing better than this.
Do you think we also need an alternate pathway for teacher education? Because I don't know that we can reform the current model of that. And so I wonder if we need another avenue for parents to validate their teachers. Because I've used what you describe as a homeschool parent. Last year, before I found the online academy I'm using this year, I had a program called High School Math online that my daughter used for her pre-calc class, because obviously I can't teach that. We had a history program. They're all separate individuals, but the beauty of it was I was able to look at their resumes. If I had wanted to, I could have background checked them individually. I had access to them one-on-one. So, but they were not accredited per se. So some parents feel like, oh, I need something to be
Yeah.
accredited. So do we need
The accreditation agencies are another lever that I think needs to be looked at very closely. And Parents Unite, I'll shout out to them. They're going to have a conference soon up in Boston, are looking at the accrediting agencies for the private schools up in New England. So, and of course, public schools have accrediting agencies as well that maybe have not been doing as good of a job. I'm a big believer in alternate route education. I was an alternate route educator, which means I did not go to an ed school. I went to Harvard in English literature, and then based on that liberal arts degree, I was recruited into the alternate route program in New Jersey, which meant I was thrown into a classroom, which I don't recommend. And then I was given my teacher training at night, paid for by the school, and I had to be supervised. You had to have a licensed teacher with me for
sure?
the first, I don't know, 30 days full time. And then after that, supervised regularly part time. So there are existing alternate route programs throughout our country. I can't speak to every state, but Google in your state alternate route if somebody's interested in teaching. I don't think, these educators are coming out so heavy in this ideology. I really wonder how much subject matter knowledge they possess, because it seems like all of their curricula is taken up with these Marxist embedded ideologies that they've been learning instead.
What I understand now, after having a panel show actually on this channel with subject matter experts from different parts of education, higher education, as well as K-12, is that it's actually explicit that they don't need it. In other words, the current thinking is you need to understand pedagogy. You don't have to know the subject matter to teach the subject matter. You just need to be a teacher. And then you can have something out of a box, or more to the point, the student will teach him or herself if you're a good enough instructor or teacher in the
Yeah,
pedagogy.
that sounds like the think method for learning to play music that was ridiculed in the Broadway show, The Music Man. Just think about the song. What was it? Da 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 da
Yes.
da 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 da. And then
Yes.
yeah, and you probably remember how it sounded when they played it.
Yeah.
No,
Well, when they taught us 3Q, and I remember thinking to
I
myself, like,
remember.
You're kidding, right? Like, I kept thinking, when's the punchline coming? This can't be real." That was exactly like the Music Man.
Yeah,
Just
kooky.
imagine what word would make sense in this sentence as if they're gonna know.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Kooky theories are in no short supply in education schools, and wacky fads come and go with regularity. And we've been educating kids for millennia, the human race. We know base. I don't know why. You know what part of the problem is the promotion and tenure process within academia. It
yeah,
requires you to get published, which requires you to come up with something new so that you can try to get into a journal. So just because something's new doesn't mean it's good,
well,
or
exactly.
different. Yeah,
And this kind
so
of research is difficult to conduct in the time span you're given.
Yep.
to publish. And so, these kinds of things, whether it's social science or even education research, take long periods of time to generate reliable results. And you can't really experiment on that many children for that period of time. And they go, oopsie, that wasn't a good idea.
I mean, social science research is, well understood to have low validity and low reliability rates, and the samples, the selection biases that operate in school systems is, yeah, a lot of this research is. I would encourage you to be skeptical of it. And yeah, a lot of these journals articles are never read by anybody, and just they exist mostly to help people to get promoted. And my husband's a professor, and I've been a professor too, so I say that, having some experience in the genre. So there are a lot of problems, but yeah, the fact that a lot of guys now are staying away from college, I think, really speaks volumes as well about, y- I guess it's very difficult for public schools to put themselves out of business, but it won't be very difficult for colleges to do so.
Yeah.
Like we talked about the humanities departments, and those have collapsed. And I guess now we have these identitarian disciplines that I suppose are proliferating. And I guess some of these people are being hired and then, becoming DEI consultants in businesses. And that's a whole other discussion, right?
Well, and apparently when they get their PhD now in, I watched a program last week, um, where a couple of CRT experts, PhDs, in fact, who are also teacher educators. Well, actually, one is a teacher educator, one was going to be a teacher educator and then said it was just too stressful. So she's starting a DEI company. But she talked about something that people had to look up. It's actually a real thing, and it apparently is called racial battle fatigue or racism battle fatigue. She complained that her entire PhD process was so traumatic that she suffered physical symptoms and almost died getting her PhD in her identitarian subject matter. That I mean, I'm watching this thinking to myself, these are people who are going to go out now and get hired by school districts to conduct DEI training of your children.
Yes. And you're reminding me again of the coddling of the American mind, and the cognitive distortions and the magnification of harm, that, maybe in many cases falls under the realm of the layperson's term exaggeration.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, I mean, I can remember. Well, let me tell you, being in graduate school when you are in the minority ideologically is also very stressful.
Mm.
Um, and we have, I think that there is such a thing as educational abuse. And we definitely at Fire see victims of it. And, we did see recently a professor who was a Fire case who committed suicide after he was ejected from the academy and offered a severance.
This was in North
Um,
Carolina? Was this the
yeah.
North Carolina case? Oh, yes, I'm very familiar with that case.
Yeah, so I would say again that sword cuts both ways, and obviously mental health is something that we all need to practice. And obviously his thinking must not have been healthy. So I, I do cynically wonder though how many times people will leverage charges, or levy charges like that in order to try to wield some power. And we
Yeah.
see that happening over and over again.
Yeah.
I'm literally, like we're literally, what is it? Committing We're massacring spirit murder out, in Seattle, I think it was. We're committing spirit murder. And I just think there's like one of the signs of an educated person is that they speak precisely, and that they recognize nuance and gradation, and this black white thinking, all or nothing, either or. um it tends to be associated with a number of diagnosable mental problems, ranging from depression, but also to things like autism or borderline personality disorder. And this is not something to encourage. This is something that the process of education should ameliorate and
Mhm.
correct. And that's also something that, as Greg points out in coddling, that cognitive behavioral therapy seeks to correct. And it's like dialectical behavior, DBT, right? Dialectical
Yes.
which is disputing it, your false beliefs. And you can tell it's a false belief because you can find logical evidence that it's not so, that it's
Right.
falsifiable. And which is exactly part of the problem with this worldview that they're promoting, is that it is unfalsifiable. You know, like you say, well, everything is racist all the time. And if you don't agree with that, it's because you're a racist. So it's like hermetically sealed, or,
Kafka
um,
trap. Mhm.
yes, it is a Kafka trap. And it's, also like an impenetrable rhetorical fortress. And these will, I think, encourage unhealthy thinking. And yeah, actually, we're in talks with um, Alana Redstone, and she
Mhm.
is establishing a center called the Mill Center, based on John Stuart Mill. And one of the points, because I'm a big believer in logic, and that logic has been removed from our schools since about the 60s. Up until then, it was a requirement for every liberal arts degree. You had the liberal arts, the ancient trivium was logic, grammar, and rhetoric, I
Right.
believe. And without logic, the false arguments, that if you just turn on the nightly news every night, you're going to hear all sorts of logical fallacies and false arguments being promoted as evidence of something or to convince you of another thing. But a person who has logic will be able to spot these and interrogate them, and reach reasoned conclusions, by looking for evidence and asking good questions. But she made the point that this is important not just for the clear educational deficit that is running throughout our institutions from K through graduate school through PhD, but also for mental health reasons. Because without logic, you will probably fall prey to the sort of reasoning that leads you into mental spirals.
Right. And that brings me to this super chat. Thank you, Jeff, for the super chat. Generally, mental health in the country can effectively be categorized as insane. People hiding under a desk hoping the gunman won't get them. It's safe until they find you. It's safer even still if you become one of them. So I take from what he's saying that, people have this sort of Faustian choice.
Mhm.
I will be perceived by the mainstream as insane, which
Right.
is not really comfortable, or I'm going to have to join something that I know is insane. Which is the rational response? It's
Right.
really difficult. And so I can see why even some 18-year-olds feel kind of like psychologically frozen.
Mhm.
And maybe even that manifests as I don't want to go outside, not because they're afraid of fresh air or they're stuck even into their phones. It's more this idea that I don't know what I'm going to find out there, and I'm actually afraid to have conversations with strangers because first of all, I'm newer at it than someone who's 35 or 40, and I don't have enough context or experience under my belt to know that the majority of people are good people, and it's just this little subset that aren't, and you just don't know what's gonna happen.
And I am hearing that kids actually believe, when you hear things like the world is going to end, we have 9 years to stop. I remember vividly, I think one of the things that affected me very profoundly from my K-12, and so I guess this is a bad K-12 experience I had, that they convinced me around second grade that we were entering a new ice age. Do you remember this?
I do remember it. It was on the cover of, I think, Time or Newsweek.
Yep,
Big
and,
deal.
I remember thinking, "Oh, I hate being cold. Oh, that's really scary. I don't wanna live in an igloo," like I was a little kid, and I was really afraid of this. And then years later, when I heard the term global warming, I was like, "Oh, no, no, no," because I was taught in second grade that we're entering a new ice age. And that was the one of the first times that I put together, like, wow, maybe that was just a fad that was happening at the time. And I was, I have a good enough memory and enough self-awareness to realize that I had been manipulated in that way, because they really made me worry about that. So I think that we are also imparting to kids some very dismal adult, I think, for purposes other than child well-being, we are sending schools are sending some messaging to kids that is hurtful to them. It is not developmentally healthy or appropriate.
And
Um,
with completely devoid of context. So, for example, one could talk about in high school, for example, the climate change theories that are out there in the context of historical climate studies and things of that nature. So, you could talk about it like
yeah.
this is a theory, this is another theory. Here are people who disagree. This is what they thought in the 70s, for example, and let the students make up their own mind and also differentiate between these theories and conservation, for example. So
Well, and it's even more than that, they tell and remember when they were gonna classify carbon whatever we exhale, is it carbon dioxide? What do we
CO2,
exhale?
yes.
Yeah, as a pollutant. I
Yeah,
mean, that's
that makes
basically
human beings pollutants.
yeah, and that is a very, very damaging message. Like I remember again in my counseling training, they talked about, in messages that we internalize, and it's like, don't be rude, don't be too smart, don't be this. But the worst message of all that you can give a kid is don't be.
Yes,
Uh, and I think that that's exactly what that message is, and then
right.
never, never, I think so. I remember having to counteract this. I had a lot of college freshmen and sophomores, and I would hear them talking all sorts of pessimistically, and I'd be like, "Oh no, no, no! Let me just tell you, you are not taking up too much room on this planet. You are welcome to be here. We need you." Like I love to just fill them with encouragement because I know how much discouragement they were given in the schools. And I also find it so discouraging that schools are sort of setting up and rewarding this Lord of the Flies kind of behavior. I mean, I was taught that was a bad thing in the days long before anti-bullying programming, but now it's like if you find a kid who's a bully, bully them, or
Oh, it's gotten worse than that is if you see inequity. So there is actually a program, and I
call
covered it
it
on a
out, call them
yes,
out,
they have
publicly
a
humiliate.
sign in the school.
Yep, and
They're
I've seen.
deputizing children to do these things.
That's yeah, that is so unhealthy, and like, what do you not did you not take adolescent psych when you were trained? Who are you? Stop it. Never, no, do not encourage that. That's the sort of thing you're supposed to be on the watch against, not to be leading. Yeah, leading the charge. Yeah, I can, and we're hearing these sad stories of kids who were filmed, with their friends. They filmed it together, and they maybe said or did some inappropriate things, as kids will do, and then years later, one of the kids will take it and put it online to ruin the kid's college chances or just to gain a little bit of attention or who knows what. Boy, is that cynical.
Yeah.
Um,
And it really the adults are teaching the kids that this is not only socially acceptable, but profitable,
right.
and it encourages it even more. So, but that brings me right, nicely into the sort of finale of this talk, which is what do you what would you say are the things parents can do right now to protect their kids if let's say they have to be in the public schools right now and all of this is going on and they're seeing this happening.
Mhm.
um I what I like that you've said is, talking about the students' rights and the ethical standards. And the reason I like that is it gets around that accusation of you don't understand this esoteric theory and stop. If you focus on the specific pedagogy or you focus on the specific lesson plan, it's like my friend Justice Graves says, you're staring at the sun and you're kind of missing the ball on the field. And so, how can parents or what are some phrases or what are some things that they can use to address this directly that whatever else you want to call it, it's not appropriate. You're violating this, that, or the other. What do you think they should do?
I think that you should go to your State Department of Ed website and you should look up the learning standards for your child's grade and subject. So if it's second grade, it's just going to be for second grade. But if it's 10th grade, it's going to be English learning standards, social studies learning standards, math learning standards. And you're going to have to scrutinize it. So know what is your child is expected to be taught. And some of those things, the learning standards for most states are still pretty solid. There is energy moving in the direction of embedding some social justice, loosey goosey, ambiguous terminology into these. But so far, and you're going to want to fight that. But so far, it's still pretty objectively useful. Things like students will be able to name the planets in the solar system and things that I think we would all agree we want kids to be able to do. So know those. And I would ask if for pre-notification of any lessons that delve into the realm of values, which traditionally has always been sent. Like when they get into sex ed in schools, didn't you get a note home?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and
Didn't
parents
get it
had
for my kids, though. When my
you.
kids were in public school, they did not send it home.
Hmm. Mine did. Yeah, so find out if you can have pre-notification of any lessons that delve into the realm of values or that might violate your family's own religious beliefs, whatever those are, your own worldview, your belief system, however you define it. And in most districts in the United States, but not all, you can ask to opt out of those lessons and be provided with a suitable alternative. And then the other thing I would say is you're going to have to um, inform yourself to a certain degree. I don't recommend looking too deeply into this abyss, but to a certain degree, which if you're listening to this podcast, I think you probably already have with these ideologies, so that you can inoculate your child by explaining the underpinnings of it, and which to me are mostly Marxist. Um, and then you're going to want to supplement and counterbalance that at home. And I do provide some suggestions on how to do that, and I'm very open and encourage people to send additional suggestions on appropriate readings to do that. And it's a blog post I wrote called "How to Raise an American," and then I appended it to, or I adjusted it to call it "How to Raise an Optimistic American," because you can raise other kinds of Americans, but I'd like to raise an optimistic one who believes in the founding values of this country and the systems that we have in place that are causing us to have a border crisis in our direction as opposed to people fleeing in the
Right.
other.
Now, finally, I want everybody to get your book. Okay, I want them to learn more and really take advantage of all this wonderful research that you have done. Can you tell people in a nutshell who's the book for and what's the main thing they're going to get out of it, so then they can go and tell their friends to buy it too?
Yeah, so Undoctrinate is for parents who are confronting ideological programming in their children's schools, and it goes through all of the different ways in which this shortchanges kids. So I look at it philosophically, pedagogically, ethically, emotionally, democratically, developmentally, and legally. So it will really arm you with the information you need to explain to teachers why this isn't a good thing, and you can just overwhelm them with the research that's embedded in the book. And then I have strategies as well for how to confront it that are in the book, and I continue to update as this situation evolves, which is happening very, very quickly. But it's also for educators, the book, and I do speak directly to them, and I actually warn them in the book. I'm like, look, if you don't get your house in order quickly, you are going to lose all of your professional operating discretion that you have long enjoyed due to the trust that has existed between families and schools for such a long time. And I would say that already that warning is too late because of the legislation that's already being enacted.
Okay. Well, I cannot thank you enough. This has been so valuable, so helpful, I think, for my audience to hear. And I do hope everybody will share this video with others who are interested in this topic. Please buy Bonnie's book and share the information about the book with other parents. There's so much good information in there that will educate them. I mean, as she said, you're going to have to inform yourself about some of these things. Much easier to just go read her book. Okay, because it's going to have a snapshot of what they need to know, along with what she calls the whoppers, which are some of the examples of what's going on. So they don't have to go searching for it, all in one place, along with some of these ideas about how to deal with it. So thank you so much, Bonnie, for being here and sharing these thoughts with us. And thank you, everybody who listened. And we'll see you next time. All right. Thanks a lot.